No question about this, that the president was briefed earlier in the week. He left on Tuesday to come to his European trip here. So certainly this is something that he knew about. And more interestingly, Wolf, as David Chalian was just saying, the president said this morning there'll be no Perry Mason moment. He said he's not going to admit, gee, I did it. He already knew about these indictments at the time. We did not know about them, of course, but that adds the context of that even more interesting, of course. So it certainly raises the stakes and adds even a different element to that meeting on Monday. But the White House, we know, this is happening as the president is meeting with the Queen. He is having his tea now at Windsor Castle with Queen Elizabeth, and then he'll be heading to his golf resort in Scotland over the weekend. We did see an interesting moment earlier this afternoon here, Wolf, and this was Sarah Sanders went up to the president and was telling him something. We don't know what. It was shortly before he arrived at Windsor Castle. She seemed to be briefing him on something. He clearly is following the news very carefully here, including those hearings yesterday. So we will wait and bring any reaction from the White House as soon as we get it for you, Wolf. He'll be on the ground here at Windsor Castle for a while and then heading to Scotland and then preparing for a Putin summit, which is even more important now, Wolf.
It certainly is.
For the hacking, it might have been some 400-pound guy in his living room, I believe he said. And also, we should note, first of all, that the fact that he did not bring an indictment against any Americans today, I wonder what the significance of that is. First of all, does it mean that they're not going to bring any indictments against any Americans? Or does it just mean in this particular indictment, all they have is against the Russians, and they are going to continue to explore what Americans knew? That said, when you think about the fact that there has been this narrative created by the president that this whole theory that the Russians interfered in the presidential election, that the Russians hacked the DNC servers and Hillary Clinton campaign staffer servers or spearphished them or whatever they did, which, by the way, a great number of Republicans have been suggesting that there's no evidence that that happened, that the Russians weren't responsible for it. Because of Robert Mueller, we now know that it's true. So however much people want to focus on Peter Strzok and Lisa Page at the FBI and their text messages, the bottom line is, according to Robert Mueller, with evidence of individuals, we know that the Russians did, according to this indictment, hack and get emails that damaged Hillary Clinton, and, according to this indictment, release them through a third party, unnamed in the indictment, although we know it to be WikiLeaks as well as DC Leaks and Guccifer 2.0, that those were released to damage Hillary Clinton. And there was discussion about when they would be released. So we know that to be the case. There's also evidence in this indictment that somebody who had a relationship with senior members of the Trump campaign was in contact with Guccifer 2.0, which we know now to be actually not just one hacker, but the Russian former military intelligence. So these are the facts as presented by Robert Mueller and the Justice Department. These are the assertions that they are making. There was election interference. They don't know if it affected the count, but all the theories, the crazy things from the fever swamps about the deep state, the crazy things about Seth Rich, none of that's true. I want to go now on the phone to Jeff Toobin to get his reaction to this indictment. Jeff.
Well, the first thing to recognize, I think, is that as a legal matter, this indictment is probably all we are going to learn about this side of the case, because these defendants are in Russia, and we don't have an extradition treaty that would cover this kind of behavior. So there is unlikely ever to be any sort of trial. Obviously, the great unanswered question is, were there Americans who were involved in this activity in any way that indicates the collusion with the Trump administration, the Trump campaign? If you read the indictment carefully, it's clear that Organization 1 is WikiLeaks, and it is somewhat surprising that WikiLeaks was not indicted. There's also a reference to a person in touch with the Trump campaign, and that certainly fits the description of Roger Stone. I think both WikiLeaks and Roger Stone will be relieved to know that they were not indicted today, but I don't think they are necessarily out of the woods. The extent of this is really extraordinary. I mean, the extent of the Russian effort to help Donald Trump win the election is extraordinary, but what remains a mystery and unresolved by this indictment is whether there was any participation or even knowledge of the Trump campaign that this effort was taking place.
Yeah.
Jeff, one of the things we know that while the Russians had this information and the Russians hacked the DNC and fished and got information from John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign chair, there were attempts at outreach to the Trump campaign by the Russian government. There was the professor with Kremlin ties who reached out to George Papadopoulos, who was a Trump campaign advisor. There was that individual who reached out to Donald Trump Jr. and said the Russian government has damaging information, dirt on Hillary Clinton, and Donald Trump Jr. said, if it's what you say, I love it. Given that information, as well as the time during the 2016 campaign when Donald Trump said, Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing, the Hillary Clinton bite. Actually, I think we have that soundbite. I'd like to play that if we can. Here's Donald Trump in 2016 asking Russia to release emails.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing.
That's in July 2016. That is during the Democratic National Convention. Given all of that swirl, do you really think, Jeffrey Toobin, that this is the last we're going to hear when it comes to the role that any Americans might have played when it comes to talking to these individuals?
Thought was Guccifer, but he had no knowledge that any illegal activity was going on. Certainly WikiLeaks has acknowledged that they released the emails. There's another reference in the indictment, which was news to me, about a contact between Russians and some American journalists. That I had not been familiar with, and it will be interesting to tease out who that might be and what went on there. But you know, it is certainly accurate to say, as your question implies, that there is a tremendous amount of smoke indicating that there was some sort of Trump campaign knowledge or involvement with this. But criminal cases are not built on smoke; they're built on fire. And certainly in this indictment, there is no even allegation, much less proof, that the Trump campaign was involved in this hacking activity.
May I add one thing to Jeffrey's observation, which is if you look at the indictment, paragraphs 43 and 44, I think are what we're talking about here, which is the description by the prosecutors of the individuals who had communication with Guccifer and DC leaks. They are reporters, they are state-registered lobbyists, they're an online political news source, they're individuals connected with the Trump campaign. It is.
And to have the Justice Department giving a preview of an indictment to someone who has an interest in the indictment is problematic. But I do think in this case, when the President of the United States is going into a meeting with the Russian leader, you don't let the President of the United States go in blindly. Now, if this indictment had involved U.S. persons affiliated with his campaign, then it's a different story. But I think the Justice Department made the right decision to give him a heads up so he didn't go into that meeting with Putin blindsided. But nonetheless, knowing this, the president knowing that there's unequivocal proof that the Russians hacked our institutions, to go into the summit and continue to make these comments so favorable to Putin and the Russians is utterly inexplicable from the perspective of U.S. national security interests. It can only be explained by the fact that Donald Trump has a single ideology that trumps everything else, and that is the ideology of self. What's good for him is all that matters.
But I do want to point out, Rosenstein did say, and I'm quoting him now, there is no allegation in this indictment that the Americans knew they were corresponding with Russian intelligence officers. How significant is that?
You know, he said essentially the same thing in the last indictment, which is a very narrow legalistic way of saying we didn't include those allegations here, but we might include them in the next